.NET for Devices presents EvenTiles Part 9, Creating a Secondary Tile. Hello, welcome back. This time we are gonna create our secondary tile. After all, that is what this application is all about. In order to do so, we're gonna take a look at our main page, because we're gonna add a button, and through that button the user can add a secondary tile for our application. So the user is going to be in control whether or not that secondary tile will be created. Now what I'm gonna do is on my content panel I'm gonna add that button, and I'm also gonna make sure that I define a couple of rows here. I'm gonna define 3 different rows, and in the center or in the second row there we're gonna add our button. So I'm taking the toolbox and we're just gonna get a button. We drag and drop that to our content panel here. I'm gonna make sure that I reset the layout for that button so it's gonna fill up the entire space it can occupy, and then we're gonna set some properties on the button. So the first thing we're gonna do is change the name of our button. I'm gonna give it a meaningful name like button install, and then we're gonna change the content of our button, because what we want our user to see is something like add tile to start screen, for instance. Just a nice little string indicating what the user might want to do. And then the next thing we're gonna do is make sure that we're gonna go position our button in that second row, or in row number 1 that is, since we start counting at 0, and we're gonna add a click event handler to our button, and inside that click event handler we're gonna add functionality to create that secondary tile programmatically. Now in order to do that I'm already creating a few helper instance variables. The first thing I'm gonna do is create a constant string, and that string is gonna have the text that will be on that button in order to install a secondary tile, because from a functionality point of view we also want to remove a secondary tile once one is available for our application. So I'm gonna create a second string constant, and this one is gonna be remove tile from start screen. So I'm gonna change the name of it. I'm also gonna change the actual string contents here, and we're gonna set remove tile from start screen, and then I'm also gonna create a boolean variable, and that boolean variable will indicate whether or not we currently have a secondary tile available for our application on the start screen. So now we're gonna create that secondary tile programmatically. And in order to do that, what we're gonna do is create a new standard tile data object. And I need to add a using statement, because we're gonna make use of shell functionality of the phone. My standard tile data object will contain all information that is going to be visible in our secondary tile. So I'm just gonna new up a standard tile data object here. I'm gonna call it new tile data, and we're gonna initialize a number of its properties right now. And the first thing we're gonna set there is the background image, and we just take the already existing background.png file that we already have for our application tile. And remember, each application has an application tile, and what we're gonna do right now is just create an additional tile. We're gonna specify that our image for our tile can be found in the file background.png. I'm also gonna give our secondary tile a title, being EvenTiles, and we set our count property to 0, so we are not showing a count on the front side of our secondary tile. Also gonna initialize the background image. I'm gonna again take an existing PNG file for that, being our background PNG file, which is nothing than a transparent image actually. So it's only gonna show a background in the color, in the system color, or in the accent color that the user selected for our device. And we're gonna give also a back title identical to the front title, being EvenTiles. And then finally we also want to have some content being displayed on the backside of our secondary tile. And we're just gonna take our content, our string that we can create through the settings page of our application, and that is defined in actual sec back content, in that property defined in our app class. And then once we have all details available for our secondary tile, what we now can do is create that secondary tile by calling a static method on the shell tile class. We're going to pass a URI, and in that URI we're going to specify to which page we are going to navigate when the user clicks on our secondary file. Optionally, we can also pass a parameter. We're going to do that because that makes it possible to distinguish between being activated from a secondary tile or just through the navigation service of our application. So this is something that is just done by specifying a URI with an optional parameter, and then we also need to pass our standard tile data to actually specify how our secondary tile is going to look like. Well, we have some issues here, so let me just quickly fix that. Looks like I needed to close down our new URI there, then remove one of our brackets over there. So it looks like we are good to go. Let me just make sure if that's the case. Okay, we have one brace too much as well. So now we should be good to actually build our application and to run it for the first time. So we're going to deploy this application now to our phone emulator. And the application is here. We should see a nice button there. We have our settings screen, so let's just change that string there real quick. And the string that we changed into, that should be visible on the backside of our secondary tile. So the thing we're going to do now is create that secondary tile by clicking on the button, and immediately what you can see is that, hey, our application is moved to the background, and you see our tile available, and you see that both sides of that tile contain data. Now if I hit the back button, our application is going to the foreground again, so it was either tombstoned or in a dormant state, and what you saw is that, hey, we still have that add message on our button. So we're going to change that, because now what we want to do in fact is actually remove that secondary tile programmatically again. So what I'm going to do is figuring out whether or not we have a secondary tile available, and we can do so by just checking that in the onNavigated_to method, because that's the method that will be called each time when we are going to our main page. So what we're going to do is figuring out if our shell tile, its collection of active tiles, if there is a tile available there, and that tile should be a secondary tile, and we can just, like find that by using a little lambda expression over here. And what we want to figure out is if we have a tile available with a specific URI, because that is how tiles identify themselves. So if we have a tile that contains a navigation URI which in itself has a particular string available, so it should contain the string, and that string should be that parameter that we were passing in our secondary tile construction. So for instance, that file ID is equals secondary. If that string is part of the URI of our tile, then we know it is a secondary tile that we just created, so we can make use of that. And we're just going to assign our Boolean variable, and depending on the fact whether or not we have a secondary tile available, what we're going to do is initialize our button either with the removal text or with the installation text. So with that we have a much better experience for our user, because now they should be able to create secondary tiles but also remove them programmatically. Now in our click event handler for a button we need to do something else as well, because if we have a tile available then we need to remove them. Otherwise we can create one. So the else clause is the one that we already have available, and now we're gonna add some logic to actually remove our secondary tile programmatically. And in order to do so, we're first going to find out if we have a secondary tile available. So what I'm going to do is just take that exact same code that we already had in our onNavigated_to method. I'm just going to figure out if that secondary tile exists by that little lambda expression that we wrote earlier. So I'm just going to copy that and paste that into our button install click event handler. Now if we have a secondary tile available, then here we have a reference to that secondary tile, otherwise we get null back. But if we do have a valid secondary tile available, well, then we're just gonna remove that secondary tile. Very simple, very straightforward, because there is a method on the secondary tile that we just got back, and that is a delete method. Now there is something else we need to do, because if we just removed our secondary tile, we also want to have the content property of our button being changed, because now we want to be able to install a secondary tile again. And we also need to indicate that, hey, currently we don't have a secondary tile installed, so I'm also going to modify that boolean variable. And with that we have the logic in place to delete secondary tiles. We also have the logic in place to create secondary tiles. We don't need to do additional things when we are creating a secondary tile, because then our application is automatically moved to the background by the operating system. So let's just take a look now. We have a secondary tile on our start screen, and if we click on our button, then our secondary tile is removed. We can verify that by taking a look at the start screen. Now we can of course add another secondary tile again, so this time we're going to make use of our default string. We're going to add one. Immediately our application is moved to the background, and here is our secondary tile again. And now it has that modified string, or our default string that we created. And if we go back this time, but if we are going back by clicking on our secondary tile, you will notice that Visual Studio's debugger will terminate. In other words, we now created another instance of our application, and that instance of our application immediately jumped to our main page. And with that we are at the end of today's video. I hope you enjoyed this, and hopefully until the next episode of EvenTiles.